Okay, today we're going to show a couple Ajax examples. One we're going to spend more time on than the other. The one that we spend less time on, it would be great if you would spend your own time reviewing it. Let's look at the curriculum first. And it's an Ajax quiz. And we can access it by going up the projector on local /Ajax. And we just have a little math quiz here of some simple addition statements. So we can type in +5 is 6, 12, 18, 12, and grade it. We got 100%. All right. If we got it wrong, let's say got 75%. All right. Notice again that we don't change URLs. We're not refreshing the page, that this is happening behind the scenes. And this is not happening. The grading is occurring on the server. Now, it makes sense to grade on the server, right? Because if you grade it on the client, then, someone could, a first grader doing addition problems like this could take a peek at the source code and maybe figure out what the answers are without knowing how to do the addition. That was meant to be a joke. If a first grader was smart enough to read source code and figure it out, they deserve the good grade. Anyhow, so let's look at this very briefly. See a lot of the elements that we had previously. My index PHP actually generates the questions. I loop through an array and I come up with these questions and I display those on a page. The array is in this include file. So I have an array, and this has the two numbers that I'm going to add together. First addend and the second addend. So you see 1 + 5, 8 + 4, 9 + 9, and so on. So the index loops through and prepares these questions. So for each element in there, it loops through and outputs the question and outputs a text box whose name is answer with an I after it, with the value of I after it. So if we look at this, answer 0, answer 1, answer 2, answer 3, so on. Oh yeah, it started with 0. I was gonna say, why is there only 3? But yeah, it started with 0, my mistake. All right, so we form the HTML that way. And when we submit it, we have our button here. On click, I call grade quiz. Now, what is JavaScript responsible in this case? JavaScript is responsible for formatting the request. We have our request object here. We loop through and get the questions and add them to the query string. So we start off with the base URL of grade.php, and we loop through and we concatenate answer sub 0 plus the thing that was in the text box, get element by ID, answer I value. And we loop through for as many questions they are, starting with 0. So the first time through the loop, we create an element on the query string that says answer 0 equals, and we pull the value from the text box that has an ID of answer 0. And we do that for all of the elements in that that exist in the array. If we're not on the last question, we display an ampersand. And I can show you what the thing looks like. That's what the URL looks like. Grade PHP question mark answer 0 equals the value from the text box. Answer 1 equals the value from the second text box. Answer 2 equals the value from the third text box. And answer 3 equals the value from that text box. So that's what that loop does. It concatenates all the answers together and forms it. And it puts a ampersand between all of them, but last one. So you notice we don't have a extra ampersand at the end. We only have them between the 3 things. All right, and then we make our request. We open our pipeline to the server. We say on ready change, do this, and then we actually make the request. So we go to the server and grade it. All we're going to do is we're going to output. We're going to loop through for each element in the array. We're going to loop through and we're going to calculate the answer. We're going to pull the answer that they made from the query string. We're going to calculate the answer. And then we're either going to output a Y or an N. All right. And we're going to put a comma between each of the entries except the last one. So I hope I can copy, yeah. So what do we get back from the server? We get back a string of Y's and N's. Y indicates that they have a correct response, N indicates that they were incorrect. So if you want to see what the server gives, you can actually paste that URL up in the address bar and see what the server gives you. And as I mentioned last time, that's a valuable debugging tool to just see exactly what's going on, especially if you're not getting the results that you'd expect. And I got them all right, so I get Y, 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 Y. I think I said the right number of Y's, 4 Y's with comma. All right, so that's what the server returns. So let's recap so far. Client side prepares and makes the request. The server side processes the request and outputs just a chunk of data in some agreed upon format. So we agreed, I agreed with myself, all right, but it could be 2 people working on this together. But it was stated that we're going to communicate the data back from the server in terms of a delimited file. A delimited file has some special character that separates entries. And in this case, it's a comma. So it's a comma delimited file. The entries are either going to be a Y or an N, and there's going to be a comma that separates them. It's then the client's job again to display that. So I have my handle response method that gets called every time the status changes. We're only interested in the status of 4 because that indicates that the server is done and has returned a request. We get back in response text that string that the server produced. So let's type in some wrong answers here. That's the query string that we send, or the URL with the query string. Okay, we get back 4 n's separated by commas because I got everyone wrong. And then we display 0%. All right, now, how do we display that 0%? Well, we take that string and we split it using a comma. What that does is that takes a string and creates an array from it based on the delimiting character that you had. So our response back from the server in this case was 4 n's separated by commas. What the split statement will do is create an array with 4 elements in it, and each of the values will be put in the array. So this will be n for element 0, n for element 1, n for element 2, n for element 3. We loop through however many answers we have in there. All right, so this we get a length of the result array. We loop through, we add up the number of questions. And if the value of the array was a y, then we increment the variable for the number of correct answers. We initialize both of them at 0. So when we're done, we have the number of correct answers and the number of questions. So we can use that to calculate the percent. All right. In this case, percent is 100 times how many correct we had divided by the number of questions. So we get whatever that percentage is, and we display it on the page. All right. Now, I have all kinds of hooks in here to do other stuff, like display, or do I? I had a version of this. I'm not sure. I don't think this is the one that did a lot of other fancy stuff too. All right. Like put an X on the page if they got a question wrong and all that, but that's we didn't do that in this version of the example. Now let's think for a second. Why would I could have had the server send back the percentage, right? That would have been easy to do. I would do essentially the same thing, except instead of sending the Y's and N's, I would compute the number right, the number of questions, and send back the percentage. But instead, I sent back the results for each question. Why do you think I did that? Just think to yourself for a second. Why did I make it so that I sent back the answer to each question, even though I'm displaying the percent? Any thoughts?
So you could style the inputs so that you could show the user which ones they got wrong.
Exactly. By sending back the individual answers, that gives the client the versatility to be able to display the results a number of different ways. Now, all I did in this example was I displayed the percentage, but I could do things like I could make the ones that they got wrong red, all right? I could tell them which problems they had a mistake in, and all that. And so by giving back the results in terms of question by question, I give the client more flexibility to format that exactly the way that I might want it. And that might change, because right now this shows, if I look at this, it shows that I got 25%, but it doesn't tell them which question is right or wrong. If by changing the client, I could make it so that it designated which answer was correct and which one was wrong. So it just gives me more flexibility on the client. Remember, the server is responsible for providing data. The client's job is to figure out how it should be formatted and displayed. All right. Let's look at the next and spend some time looking at this in more detail if you want. We have another example we're going to spend a little more time on. And this is a dictionary, a translation dictionary. I hate when that happens. What's it called? Dictionary.html. And this is a list of mathematical terms that you can get them translated into Spanish, right? So this would be something possibly that could come from a database. I'm not using a database in this example. I'm using just an array, but this very well could be done in a database. But what happens is as I type in the letters, I see a list of things that start with the character that I typed in. So nothing in there, I type in an A. I see all the mathematical terms, the English mathematical term that starts with an A. I type in the next letter, D, let's say, D, and it shows me all the terms that start with an A and a D. It does that down the line until they're, until you found the one that you want. When you find the one that you want, you click on it and click go. And it shows you the Spanish translation. Now, I took the Spanish translation from somewhere, so if this isn't correct, don't blame me. But I can go and get the translation of it into Spanish. All right. So let's see how this works. Again, there's 3 points that we're going to look at. There's 3 things that we're going to look at. 3 steps, I guess. Step number 1 is the client side making the request. That gets the ball rolling in Ajax. And it's based on a user event typically. In this case, it is based on the on-key up event. Now, you actually can have a different event is when you press the key down versus when you release it. All right. So this is, I believe, on the on-key up event because then the character is actually put in the text box. It's hard to do it without holding it down too long, but when I let go, it goes and does that. I think it's on the on. So that's the event that starts the ball rolling. So let's look at that code. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to do this. This is some old doc type code for doing something in XHTML. We typically don't do it that way anymore, but forgive that. All right, I have actually 2 request objects. There's actually 2 different kinds of Ajax requests made here. Number 1 is when I type in a character, and I make the request to get the list of words that match that. If I type in A, I get the list of words. That's Ajax request number 1. Ajax request number 2 is when I select one and I click go. And that gets the Spanish translation. So I actually have 2 request objects. Same as I've done before. We've seen this before. Now, on key up, I call the function get words, and I pass in the value of the text box. This refers to this text box. Whenever we use this, it means whatever object you're currently in. So in this case, we are in that text box element, that text box object. Therefore, when I say give me this dot value, I'm talking about the value of the text box. So I call the method get words, and I pass it whatever's in the text box, whether it be 1, 2, 3, or however many characters. What does get words do? Well, it makes a request. First of all, if I've entered nothing in there, or if it begins with a space, should just trim it. Whatever. There's nothing in here, I clear out the drop down. I get a pointer to the drop down and I make the options length 0. That effectively gets rid of all the options. So if there's nothing in here, if there was something in here from before, and I clear out the text box, it clears out the drop down. Otherwise, I'm going to make the request to dictionary1.php word equals, and the value is the argument that was entered. So if I type in an A here, I'm submitting to this URL. With an A. And again, I can call that right from the address line to see what it's going to return. And as I mentioned before, that's very useful in debugging, because a lot of this goes on and you don't see necessarily what's going on unless you make some effort to see it. So here I'm going to show you what this is going to return when I've typed in an A. So what it's going to return is data that looks like this. Now this is delimited data, all right? And there's pairs of values that make up a single entry in the dropdown. There's the English term, a colon, and the position in the array that this is. There's an array that I'm using for this. These are called parallel arrays because I have an English array and a Spanish array, and there's a one-to-one matchup between the two. So for every element in the English array, the corresponding element that has the same index is the Spanish version of the word. So absolute value is in position 0 in the array. So as we can see here, absolute value is in position 0 in the array. And when we look at the Spanish array, it's also in position 0. That's called a parallel array, when you have indexes that match things together. Then I have a colon. And then I have the next pair of word index, all the way down the line. So this is delimited data that's delimited by two things. It's delimited by a semicolon, and it's delimited by a colon. The colon separates entries that are going to be in the dropdown. So each one of these, separated by a colon, is a new entry in the dropdown. The semicolon separates the word from the index in the dropdown, and we're going to use both of those when we construct our dropdown. So let's look at the code that returns this. Let's look at dictionary 1 PHP. All right, I include dictionary. I get the value from query string for word. I then loop through. For every element in the list, and I see if the position of that word in the English language array is equal to 0. So this might be a little bit of a confusing instruction. Let's talk about it. String position, what does that do? That tells me where in a word does the substring appear. All right. So for example, my name is Zellers. If I did a string position for Z, it would show me position 0 because it's at the very beginning. If I did a position of E, it would show me 1. If I showed a position of S, it would show me, or if I asked for where S is, it would show me 6 because it's in the 6th position when you start numbering with 0. So this is going to look at the text that we've entered in, the word that we've entered in, or partial word that we've entered in. And we're going to see where it appears in each of the elements of the array. And if it equals 0, then we got a match. We're going to output the English word, semicolon, and the index, and then a colon. So we're going to output, A matches absolute value, so we output the word, the index. These are separated by a semicolon, and at the end of that string is a colon. Now this is interesting. We have 3 equal signs. And I don't know if you've seen 3 equal signs before. I don't know if I talked about that in class. Equal sign is 3 equal signs matches not just the value, but the type. All right. You can really get into some confusing things with empty strings and nulls and things like that, where the comparison between those is sometimes misleading and inaccurate. To guarantee that this is a numerical 0, that this function returns a numerical 0, I use the 3 equal signs. Because then what I would get back from that function has to be a number whose value is 0. If it returns a null or if it returns an empty string or something like that, I don't know if this function would, but if there was a function that returned a null or an empty string, that wouldn't count, right? It has to be a numeric 0. If I made through the entire list and there's no value that matches, I have this B none value. If I make it through the entire array and I haven't found a match, then I'm going to print no words match this pattern. I give an index of -1. So for example, if I looked for, let's put a nonsense string in here, I get no word match that pattern, -1. There's only one, it shows me 1. All right. So this is what the client is getting back in response text. This big old string of data. Now, again, the last part of the process is the client takes that string and does something with it. I make my on ready state change create dropdown. So when this finishes and it gets a status of 4, create DD function gets called. I make sure the ready state is 4. I take the response text and I clear out the dropdown. I create an array called A English that splits my response text by the colon. So what that is going to do is that's going to take this response text string that we get back from the server, and it's going to make this element 1 in the array. It's going to make this element 0 in the array. It's going to make this element 1, this element 2, this element 3. So for however many elements we have, it's going to create an English array that has those elements. And each element is going to be a word and a position in the array. Then, for each element in there, I split it again. I split it based on a semicolon. So I get this A option that's going to have a 2-element array. This is always going to be 2, right? Because there's always the word, a semicolon, and a number. I'm going to split that, each option, into an array, and I'm going to create an option for the drop-down list that uses the word as a description and the option here for the value, the element and the index value as the value of the drop-down. If this is this comes back as one big string called response text. I split it based on the colon. So everywhere there's a colon, it creates a new entry in that A English array. So this is element 0 in the English array. This is element 1, and so on, all the way through element 26. I'm then going to loop through that English array, which could have any number of values. And I'm going to split each entry in that array using the semicolon to pull out the value, the description that I want to appear in the option and the value that I want the option to have. So the first element in that dropdown is going to have a display value of absolute value, and it's going to have a value of 0 all the way through the line. So that's the first Ajax request that's made. So at this point, we're at here. And every time we repeat it, we get a new value, we clear out the dropdown and redisplay the dropdown. Now, when we click on it and click go, we make our second Ajax request. And this is a lot simpler than the first Ajax request. We're going to send, what do you think we're going to send? We're going to send the element of the array that this is. So axis is in position 26 in the array. That's the value of this in the dropdown. We click go. We're going to send that 26 to the server to a different script, and it's going to give us the Spanish language version. So let's look to see how we do that. Click on, click on the button to get translation. Get translation finds the value. This is sort of an old-fashioned way of getting the value from a dropdown. And if the value from the dropdown is -1, we simply display, hey, you have to select a valid word. Select a valid word. That doesn't get sent as an Ajax. That just, the client just outputs that. Otherwise, we create our request to the second script, and we give it the index of the array. And we get back the answer. So we create the request, we pass the value of the dropdown. It's part of the index. On ready state change, we display the translation. And display translation simply takes what was returned display translations right underneath it. Yeah, we simply take the response text, and there's no parsing to do because we're just getting back one piece of data. We don't have to split it into pieces or anything. We just take that and display it on the page. So one of the key things in Ajax is splitting what you get back from the server into its individual parts. Now, way back in the middle of the semester, when you had the weather example, you got back JSON data, and you split that chunk of JSON data into pieces and pulled out the high temperature, the low temperature, I don't know, other information, whatever other information it was on that weather application. So this is a different way of doing it, and it's using delimited data. Your three biggest options are to use delimited data, to use JSON, or to use XML. And I have XML and JSON versions of this dictionary application that does the drop down using getting back from the server JSON data and getting back from the server XML data. XML, for those of you who haven't done it, is sort of like a HTML-like language in that it uses tags to designate particular values. And nice thing about XML is it can show structure. For simple cases, if you're returning data that all looks the same, delimited works as well as anything else, and it has less overhead, less extra data to transport. If you have data that has a structure, like for example, if I was returning a book might have, might have the information, the title of the book, when it's published and all that. But then it might have an array of authors because a book can have more than one author. That's like a structure of data. That's more complex than structure of data. And each piece of data is going to look a little bit different because one might have two authors rather. One might have 5 authors. So that all the data doesn't look the same, and therefore it's best to use XML or JSON for that kind of data. Now, your last assignment, I've been thinking about this a lot. I am going to have a lecture next week. This is the only, you're lucky. This is the only class that I'm having a lecture next week. All the rest of them you're working on your projects. But this class, CISS232, I'm having a lecture. And I'm going to go over the final lab assignment, which, you could almost consider that like a final exam in a way. Though I do plan on being very generous in grading because it is a challenging assignment. And I will talk about it, and I have to figure out exactly what I want to talk about. Do I want to talk about everything and let you figure some stuff out, or do I want to show you a similar example, or I don't know. I'll have to decide. I'll have to decide what I want to do as far as that goes. But in that case, you're going to have something similar where you're pulling data from a database and you're pulling data that matches certain criteria using the like expression in the database. And yeah, so you could be pulling back multiple rows. And each row can have multiple fields in it. So my suggestion for you with that would be to use delimited data, similar to what I did in this example. If you're adventurous, feel free to start working on that now. If you don't feel quite so adventurous, next week I'm going to go over it in more detail. Don't be intimidated by it. This is an experiment. First time I've ever had this lab in class. It would be really cool, even if you don't get it right, to sort of expose you to this kind of thinking. And yeah, we'll go over it next week in more detail. So we will see you next week or in lab. Are there any questions now? All right, that's all I had for today.